Hi, this is Phoenix, and I'm going to talk about a subject that I enjoy thinking through, and that is the relationship between the mind and the physical world, or rather the world that exists around us, however we conceive reality, but generally the physical world. I want to do that by thinking of some of the philosophy and metaphysics of Eldon Taylor. One of the amazing points that he brings up is this idea that there is a causal connection between the thoughts in our mind and the universe, or the world, and but he means this in a very metaphysical sense. So he doesn't mean this really in terms of cause and effect, where we have a certain thought and then we act on that thought, and that's the correlation between our thought and the physical world or reality. Rather, it's more of a metaphysical view where our thoughts can ultimately manifest certain aspects in reality and can manifest things in reality that otherwise wouldn't exist. It can manifest possibilities. I think this is an interesting claim. There's certainly some backing with this metaphysical claim, despite how wild it is. When you think about contemporary quantum mechanics and the idea that the very fact that our mind can conceive of something on the quantum level can make certain quantum things happen, certain things on the small scale that happen because of our mind. It's a very George Berkeleyan view, this idea that the quantum level is dependent on what the mind can conceive and what the mind is willing to conceive. So I've been thinking about this notion of how the world is linked to my mind, how the universe is linked to my mind. And I want to start by thinking through the idea that the great thing about philosophy is that even though it seems to sometimes just be books and books of ideas, of rationality and nothing substantial, nothing practical, what it actually does is it sets the stage for choice, and it sets the stage for decision. And so ultimately what happens is philosophy and the ideas of philosophy provide a template of potential decisions you can make and potential decisions that can happen, and that you can act upon. But of course what's interesting about Taylor is that he takes this claim even further by implying that, again, as I said earlier, our thoughts can actually manifest in reality just by the very fact of the thought existing. And I think this is a very powerful idea. And to be honest, I'm still trying to work through the idea. But my understanding of this metaphysical conception is essentially that I would have to say that I think it's true to an extent. Due to modern science and the way that we are taught to think because of modern science, many people would say that there are certain laws of physics, certain laws of the physical world that can't be violated, and essentially the mind is disconnected from all of that. And so there's no way that a thought can manifest anything in reality. However, I tend to reject this claim. I definitely don't have any basis for this idea, or any proof for this idea, but I do have a framework in which we can think about this idea. Now, of course, we have to take into account cause and effect, even though in quantum mechanics they say that cause and effect doesn't really exist, at least on the quantum level. For day-to-day purposes, we of course say that cause and effect exists. And so the framework that I'm gonna work with is this idea that we are realistic about how certain things are going to happen due to our actions, and also be aware of the fact that we can only choose certain decisions at once. But I want to also say that what's great about this, despite this limitation, is that we can still make decisions consecutively in a series, and that gives us more choices rather than just thinking we can only make one choice. And so that's just something to think about. Now, the framework that I want to operate is this idea that whenever we think about, whenever we have any thoughts, um, essentially we can act on the thought. Um, and Sorry, it's kind of a tricky idea. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to articulate it. But the idea is that if we take into account this notion that um, certain things can happen, um, or certain things will happen based off our action, um, but rely on the unpredictability of that action, it frees us. And it frees us in the sense that we're not so worried about the constraints of our action. And so there's definitely some freedom in that. Now, again, to go back to the framework that I was trying to provide, it's kind of a difficult framework to think through. But the basic idea is that it's going to be anecdotal too. But I was trying to think of this notion of how my mind can influence the universe, even though there would, in a sense, be no causal connection. And the idea that I thought of was that I would be happy if I was able to come to some kind of unconscious conclusion based off something that I'd seen, and then that would slowly make its way into my consciousness later on. And so now if you and so this was my way of essentially experimenting with this idea of my thoughts manifesting in reality in some way. Now, this is a way to experiment with this metaphysical idea, but it's a way to where you wouldn't get lost in too many unsubstantiated ideas. It would allow for simple freedom. And so, what ended up happening was I observed plenty of things that had happened during a dinner that I had attended. And I was perfectly thinking about this idea of what piece of information am I supposed to be looking for that's essentially going to lead to some kind of breakthrough. And what was really cool was that information turned out to be a contradiction that I noticed in certain expressions. So to use the example that I had in mind, the phrase hit and miss stuck out, and I have enough evidence to believe that the unconscious thought was that I was trying to understand what hit and miss means, but then it finally came to my consciousness, my conscious level, and I was able to think about how essentially the term hit and miss is an interesting phrase, because when you take the word literally, hit and miss, when you take the phrase literally, hit and miss means a hit and a miss happened at the same time. But if you focus on the idea or the phrase of hit and miss, and what it literally means, it means there either was a hit or a miss. It will either be a hit or a miss. And those are two very different things. Now, this probably isn't that original of an idea, but it certainly was an original idea in the context in which the idea came to me, and thinking about the phrase, because the phrase hit and miss stuck out a lot in my mind in a way that was pretty remarkable. And so you might be wondering what this has to do with the idea of thoughts being causal to what happens in the universe. Now, it's interesting because Taylor has some affinities to the law of attraction, which is the idea that our thoughts can shape reality, simply our thoughts. So if we think negative thoughts, then negative things happen in the world and manifest around us. If we think positive thoughts, then positive thoughts happen. What I want to say is that what's really important about what happened with this idea that stuck with me is that I started to believe that using my mind, I could start to manifest certain things. And essentially what I thought could materialize was some kind of idea. Um, and that was, and so the philosophical underpinning behind that was, again, Taylor's idea of our thoughts having a causal relationship to what happens in the universe. And that seemed to happen with me because as I was thinking of that idea, it seemed that what I really wanted was to have some kind of understanding, have some kind of breakthrough. And so by using the structure in which I used the framework, I was able to come to that remarkable idea. Now, there's some other things in this book, or there's some other things in the book by Taylor. One of his ideas is this idea that we attract certain kinds of situations, and I thought that was interesting. Just something to think about, because I think it's a pretty powerful idea. And I started thinking about that in terms of what kind of situations do I attract? Well, because I tend to be a neurotic, confused individual, I probably tend to attract a lot of confusion in the world. And so I started thinking through the Buddhist notions of having a straight mind. In the Buddhist book, Path of Perfection, or Path to Perfection, it talks about having a mind that is straight, so essentially as straight as an arrow, so it can be effective. And I think that that's a pretty important insight to keep in mind in terms of how the mind should work. And so I started to think about that and wondering if maybe I needed to straighten out my mind, so to speak, if I needed to work on keeping it calm, and then maybe I would attract less confusion. And that kind of actually seemed to be the case. Of course, there's no way to substantiate it because we're in the realm of metaphysics, at least not generally. But experimenting with it was pretty interesting because that was kind of my feeling, that I felt more of an internal peace. I kind of understand that confusion is my character, but I think that's okay because I think there's also a strange kind of penetrating insight that I certainly don't understand, but that I think that I occasionally have, and that is occasionally useful. So I did want to say, in terms of thinking about the idea of how our thoughts are related to reality, what's interesting to me is that there's kind of built-in paradoxes with this assumption. The main problem that I see, the main paradox that I see is this idea that whenever you are thinking something, you immediately want to so let's say that you're trying to think positive about something because you want something positive to happen. Well, if something negative happens, and this is of course taking into account the real world as they call it, the things that are out of your control, if something negative happens because of your positive action, your positive thought, then that is of course surprising. But here's the catch: if you think negatively about what happened, then you essentially betray your thought and essentially betray what that thought could do, and thereby you invite the negativity. But you're also realistic. However, if you choose to do the opposite, you're not realistic about what has happened, and because you're not realistic, you may misassess the situation, which could lead to further problems. So that's why, as much as I enjoy metaphysics, I would certainly take it all with a grain of salt and think through it. But I think there's a lot to be said that even if we can't substantiate the claim that our thoughts can create strange things in the universe, it certainly challenges the notion that the universe is static, that our world is static, that things aren't unchanging, and at the very least it empowers our mind and empowers what our mind can do. And as you can see, the framework that I worked with in my experience brought me to some insights, and it brought me to some insights because I had that really good metaphysical idea and I was able to run with it, and it led to really interesting things. Again, this is Phoenix, and thank you.